He almost walked past him. The heat was brutal that afternoon, the kind of sun that makes the asphalt ripple like boiling water, and David had somewhere to be. He was running late for a meeting downtown, his phone buzzing in his hand, his shirt sticking to his back as the traffic screamed all around him. But then, something made him stop. At first, it was just a flicker. A shadow slouched against a crumbling wall near the edge of the marketplace. A man, barefoot, clothes ripped, head down, hands clasped around a plastic cup with a few crumpled bills inside. David almost didn't look twice. Beggars weren't uncommon here. But then the man lifted his head, and everything inside David froze. His heart slammed into his chest. There was something about those eyes. They were sunken, bloodshot, worn down by years of exhaustion. But they weren't unfamiliar. No, he knew those eyes. He'd spent years laughing with those eyes, fighting with them, dreaming alongside them. And now, they were staring back at him, hollow, broken, almost unrecognizable. The man whispered David's name. It wasn't loud, just a rasp, cracked and dry, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. David staggered, blinking against the sunlight as though reality itself had tilted beneath his feet. He crouched down, closer now, his shadow falling across the man's face. "Moussa?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The man nodded weakly, his lips trembling. For a moment, David couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It had been 15 years since he last saw Moussa, his childhood best friend, the boy who used to climb mango trees with him, who'd saved him once when he almost drowned in the river, the boy who swore they'd always have each other's backs. Back then, they dreamed of escaping this neighborhood together, going to university, building something better. And then, Moussa disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation. One day he was there, the next he was gone. David searched for months, asking everyone, following rumors, but eventually he stopped. Life moved forward. And now here he was, sitting on the filthy ground, wearing someone else's life like a stranger's clothes. David's voice cracked as he asked, "What happened to you?" Moussa stared down at his shaking hands, silent for a long moment before whispering, "It's a long story." The sound of the marketplace buzzed behind them. Vendors shouting, car horns blaring, kids laughing. But here, in this strange, fragile bubble of reunion, time seemed to slow. Mousa's story didn't come out all at once. First, it was fragments. His father died when he was 19. The debts piled up. The small shop his family owned went under. His mother got sick. Then came the wrong crowd. Men who promised quick money. Men who smiled with knives behind their teeth. A fight, a knife, a police raid, jail. And when he finally got out, there was nothing left. No family, no home, no job. He tried, he really had, but doors kept closing until the streets became the only place left to go. David felt his throat tighten, but before he could speak, Moussa looked up at him, eyes glinting wet in the sunlight, and said something David would never forget. "I kept thinking one day I'd see you again, but not like this, not like this." And then, as if the universe itself was playing some cruel trick, David's phone buzzed again. His meeting, his obligations, his carefully built life pulling at him like a rope. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not from this. He reached into his wallet, pulling out every bill he had, pressing it into Mousa's shaking hands. But Moussa didn't move, didn't look down, didn't even count it. Instead, he whispered, "I don't want your money, David. I just want to remember who I used to be." Those words haunted David all day. That night, lying awake in his perfectly air-conditioned apartment, he couldn't stop replaying the image of Moussa on the sidewalk, his friend's dignity swallowed by years of survival. The next morning, he made a decision. David returned to the marketplace. This time, Moussa wasn't there. Panic clawed at his chest as he searched alley after alley until he finally found him, curled beneath a tattered sheet behind a shuttered shop. David crouched beside him and shook his shoulder gently. Moussa stirred, blinking groggily, and David said, "Get up, come with me." At first, Moussa refused. Shame had rooted him in place, chains stronger than any steel. But David didn't give up. He bought him food, new clothes, paid for a small room in a guest house nearby, and promised to help him get back on his feet. For weeks, it was slow progress. Moussa flinched at kindness, recoiled from simple comforts, as though he didn't believe he deserved them anymore. But David kept showing up, every single day. And just when it seemed like hope was finally flickering back to life, everything nearly fell apart. 3 weeks later, David came by to check on Moussa, but the room was empty. His bag was gone, the bed untouched. A woman downstairs said she saw him leaving early that morning, heading toward the old bus station. Panic surged through David. He raced across town, weaving through the chaotic traffic, heart pounding as dread twisted his stomach. And then he saw him, Moussa, standing on the edge of the road, a crumpled envelope clutched in his hands. David grabbed his shoulder. "Where are you going?" Moussa stared at him for a long, heavy moment, then handed him the envelope. Inside was a single folded piece of paper with one line scribbled in shaky handwriting. "I'm going to find the men who ruined my life." And just like that, Moussa stepped off the curb and disappeared into the crowd. David stood there frozen, watching his friend vanish into the chaos of the city, feeling the weight of 15 lost years pressing down on his chest. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, because what Moussa was about to do next would change everything. David stood there frozen, the sounds of the city muffled around him, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. He stared at the note again, his fingers trembling. "I'm going to find the men who ruined my life." The words looped in his head like a siren, growing louder and louder until the world tilted beneath his feet. By the time his senses returned, Moussa was gone. David shoved the note into his pocket and started running, weaving through the chaos of horns, shouting vendors, and motorbikes tearing through the street. But it was no use. Moussa had vanished, swallowed by the city he once called home. That night, David didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mousa's face. Not the boy he remembered, but the haunted man crouched on the pavement, a storm raging behind his tired eyes. He kept hearing Mousa's voice. "I just want to remember who I used to be." And now, Moussa was walking straight into the shadows of his past, carrying nothing but rage and despair. The next morning, David started searching. He retraced every alley, every dusty back road, every cramped block of the marketplace where Moussa used to spend his days. At the bus terminal, he asked around. No one had seen him. He checked the small guest house, the soup kitchen down the street, the abandoned football field where they used to play as kids. Nothing. By the third day, David was beginning to fear the worst. And then, he found a lead. A street vendor, an older woman selling roasted maize, said she'd seen Moussa the night before. "He wasn't alone," she whispered, glancing around nervously. 3 men were with him. They didn't look like friends. David's chest tightened. He asked where they went, and the woman hesitated before pointing down a narrow alley leading into the old industrial district, a place people avoided after dark. The factories there had been abandoned for years, but everyone knew what they'd become. Hideouts for gangs, black market deals, and men who didn't like questions. David hesitated, debating whether to follow, but something deep inside him, a pull stronger than fear, pushed him forward. The alley stretched ahead like an open wound, shadows clinging to cracked walls covered in faded graffiti. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, until the noise of the marketplace vanished entirely. That's when he heard it. Faint voices, muffled, low, coming from behind a rusted gate at the end of the lane. He crept closer, hiding behind a broken stack of pallets, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Through a gap in the gate, David could see them, Moussa and 3 men he didn't recognize. One sat on a crate, smoking lazily, while the other 2 loomed over Moussa, who stood rigid, shoulders tense, fists clenched at his sides. "You owe us," one of the men growled. "You know how this works." Mousa's voice was steady but strained. "I don't owe you anymore. I paid for what happened. You know I did." The smoker laughed, exhaling a cloud of gray. "Paid? You think a few years behind bars clears your debt? You cost us everything, Moussa. You cost us money. And you know what happens when people cost us money. David's stomach dropped as he realized what this was. This wasn't just about revenge. Moussa had been tangled in something bigger than he'd ever imagined. And now these men were here to collect. Moussa shook his head slowly. You destroyed my life once. You're not doing it again. And then, before anyone could react, Moussa lunged. Chaos erupted. Fists slammed. Crates toppled. Someone yelled. And in the blur of motion, David couldn't tell who was hitting who. One of the men grabbed a broken bottle and swung wildly. Moussa ducked, grabbed his arm, and twisted hard enough to make the bottle clatter to the ground. But then another figure stepped in from the shadows. A fourth man David hadn't seen before, tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep scar cutting across his cheek. He didn't say a word. He just lifted a pistol and aimed it directly at Mousa's chest. David's heart stopped. Without thinking, he stumbled out from behind the pallets, shouting, "Stop!" All four men turned, the guns swinging toward him, the silence suddenly thick and dangerous. The scarred man squinted at David, then smirked coldly. "You shouldn't be here." Before David could respond, Moussa stepped between them, breathing hard, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Leave him out of this," he said firmly, his voice trembling but defiant. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the scarred man lowered the gun, but his smile didn't fade. He stepped close to Moussa, close enough that their foreheads nearly touched, and whispered something David couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it made Moussa go pale. The men turned and left, their footsteps fading into the shadows. David rushed to Mousa's side. What did he say? Who are they? But Moussa didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, shoulders shaking, jaw clenched tight enough to crack his teeth. Finally, after what felt like forever, he whispered, "This isn't over, David. They're going after someone else now." David frowned, confused. "Who?" Moussa turned to face him, his eyes wide and haunted, his voice barely audible when he said the name. And when David heard it, his blood ran cold. Because the name Moussa whispered wasn't some rival, wasn't some distant figure from his past. It was someone David knew, someone close, someone who had no idea what was coming. David grabbed Moussa by the arm, pulling him away from the alley as his mind raced. 100 questions colliding in his head. How deep had Moussa been pulled into this? Who were these men really? And what would happen when they reached the person whose name Moussa had just spoken? They didn't have answers yet, but they didn't have time either, because the next 24 hours would decide everything. The sound of the city faded behind them as David pulled Moussa into the quiet of a side street, his breath sharp, his hands still trembling. He couldn't stop replaying the name Moussa had whispered in that alley, the name that tied everything together and made his stomach twist into knots. "Are you sure?" David demanded, his voice cracking. Moussa nodded silently, his eyes dark and heavy with shame. The name he'd said was Amira, David's younger sister, the one who had nothing to do with any of this. David felt his chest tighten as his thoughts scattered, every muscle in his body screaming to act, but Moussa grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're not after her because of me. They're after her because of you." David froze, his mind trying to process the words, but before he could respond, Moussa kept talking, his voice trembling as though every sentence was costing him pieces of himself. 15 years ago, when everything went wrong, when the police came for us, I didn't disappear, David. I ran. But I didn't just run from them. I ran from you, and I never told you why." David felt like the ground had been pulled from beneath his feet. Moussa looked away, swallowing hard, his hands twisting together as though wringing invisible blood from his fingers. "The night I was arrested, it wasn't supposed to go that way. The men you saw today, I used to work for them. We were desperate, and I thought I could get us out, thought one job would fix everything. But someone betrayed them, gave their names to the police, tipped them off before the raid." He hesitated, then looked straight into David's eyes. "They think it was me, but it wasn't. It was your father." The words hit like a gunshot. David staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. His father, the man who died 10 years ago. Moussa nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. He found out what we were into. He went to the police trying to save us, but they found out before the raid even happened. They killed one of their own men that night, and they swore they'd come for whoever set them up. David's pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. The puzzle pieces he hadn't even known were missing started clicking violently into place. These men weren't after Moussa for revenge. They wanted leverage. They wanted him to pay the debt they believed his family owed. And now they were going after Amira to get to David. David grabbed Mousa's shoulder, panic sharp in his voice. Where would they take her? Moussa hesitated, then finally said, "There's an old warehouse on the edge of town. It's where they handle things they don't want seen." Without another word, they ran. The sun was setting by the time they reached the outskirts, painting the horizon in deep orange and blood-red hues. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a skeleton of rusted steel and shattered windows, its silence heavier than the air itself. As they crept closer, David could hear muffled voices inside, low and deliberate, punctuated by bursts of cruel laughter. His stomach churned when he spotted Amira through a cracked window, tied to a chair, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling. David's heart pounded so violently he thought it would explode. Moussa grabbed his arm, whispering, "We need a plan." But David was already moving, rage burning hot and blinding. Before Moussa could stop him, David kicked the side door open and stormed inside. The room fell silent. 4 men turned to face him, the same faces from the alley, including the scarred man with the pistol. He smiled coldly, as though he'd been expecting them. "Well," he said softly, his voice smooth and deadly, "the prodigal son returns." David stepped forward, forcing strength into his voice. "Let her go. She has nothing to do with this." The scarred man tilted his head, almost amused. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about her. It's about blood. Your father stole from us. Your family pays." Before David could reply, Moussa stepped into the light, his face shadowed but his voice steady. "This is between you and me. Leave them out of it." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, and for a long, breathless moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. Then he laughed, a low, chilling sound that sent shivers crawling up David's spine. "You think you can bargain with me, Moussa? You think you're worth more than she is?" And then it happened. Everything erupted at once. Moussa lunged. David grabbed the nearest crate and swung it, knocking one man to the ground. Amira screamed as another tried to pull her from the chair, but Moussa tackled him, fists slamming, pure desperation in every blow. The scarred man raised his pistol, but David dove, grabbing his arm and slamming it against a pillar. The gun clattered to the floor. It should have been over, but it wasn't, because as Moussa turned to untie Amira, the scarred man pulled a knife from his boot and lunged. David shouted, but Moussa was faster. He spun, grabbing the man's wrist, struggling as the blade inched closer, the muscles in his arms trembling with the effort. And then, Moussa made a choice. With a raw, guttural scream, he twisted hard, forcing the knife into the scarred man's chest. The man gasped, staggered, and collapsed. For a second, the silence was deafening. Then the other men bolted, disappearing into the shadows. David rushed to Moussa, his voice panicked, his hands shaking. "We have to go. Now." But Moussa wasn't moving. He was slumped against the pillar, breathing shallowly, blood spreading across his shirt. David dropped to his knees, grabbing his friend's face, his words spilling out in choked, desperate fragments. "Stay with me, Moussa. Stay with me. Please, we made it, we're safe, you're safe." Moussa smiled weakly, his voice barely audible. "I told you, I didn't want your money. I just wanted to remember who I used to be." And then his hand slipped from David's, and his eyes closed. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance as David sat there, holding his friend in his arms, the weight of 15 lost years pressing down on him like the air had been stolen from the world. Amira knelt beside them, sobbing quietly, her face buried against David's shoulder. Outside, the city pulsed on, unaware that in this forgotten corner, a boyhood promise had finally been broken and fulfilled. Because in the end, Moussa hadn't just saved David's sister, he'd saved David. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.